to introduce contemporary academic discourses on Shia studies to the wider intellectual community. And the center also provides support for the Foundation's Freedom of Religion and Belief program in the Middle East, South Asia, and elsewhere. The Al-Khoei Foundation was founded in 1989. The foundation, with its headquarters in London, has more than 15 branches in some of the most important cities of the world, and has grown to become the largest international Shia organization. In 1997, the foundation became the fourth Muslim organization and the only Shia organization to hold general consultative status in the United Nations, where it currently promotes human rights and minority rights. The foundation is involved in charitable work, also running schools in London and New York, helping orphans in Iraq, running religious institutions in Pakistan and many other countries. The foundation is known for its interfaith and community dialogue. One of the greatest achievements of the foundation, among many, was the inclusion of Shia faith in the GCSE Islamic Studies syllabus. The foundation published a booklet on the fundamentals of Shia Islam for the training of teachers. Lastly, the foundation has recently become the part of a consortium called CREED, which is led by the Institute of Development Studies. The CREED is an action-based research project, focuses in 5 countries, including Iraq and Pakistan. If you want to know more about our work, please feel free to contact us. We would be happy to share. Before I introduce my guest, please remember Sayyid Yusuf in your prayers. He's hospitalized due to some post-COVID complications. Hassan Abbas is a distinguished professor of international relations at the Near East South Asia Strategic Studies Center at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He serves as a senior advisor at Project on Shiaism and Global Affairs at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He's the author of numerous publications, including a very important book called The Taliban Revival, Violence and Extremism on the Pakistan-Afghanistan Frontier. Professor Sajjad Rizvi is an associate professor of Islamic intellectual history and Islamic studies at the University of Exeter, where he is also the director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. Professor Rizvi is an intellectual historian and specializes in philosophy, theology, and the Quranic exegesis. His extensive scholarship of Mullah Sadra has no parallel. He has written 4 books on subjects such as Mullah Sadra, metaphysics, and the Quranic exegesis. There is a huge list of his publications and book chapters, which you can see on the university's website. Without further ado, I would request Professor Hassan Abbas to share his thought on his book.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much. It's an honor and a delight to be here. My apologies for being a little late with the traffic. I had little idea, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I'm also very thankful to both the moderator, who has really supported the book through a review, through many other ways as well, and through social media as well. Also, Professor Sajjad has been very kind and very supportive, and his I'm a big fan of his scholarship and the way he has helped us understand Mullah Sadra in ways that I think no other modern contemporary Muslim scholar has done. The purpose is here with the small group we can make benefit of this and have more of an interactive session. I know I look forward to some of the questions from Professor Sajjad soon, so my initial comments will not be more than 5 to 7 minutes, just to frame the issue and tell you some of the very basic things. And then we can, I think if the plan is fine, I'll hand it over to Professor Sajjad for his any comments and questions, and then it'll be great to have a conversation. Let me begin by saying on the book that the purpose of the book was to present the life, the ideas, the ideals, and the teachings of Imam Ali to the Western audience, first and foremost, and irrespective of whether somebody is Muslim or not, and then also to present it in a way which is attractive to the young mind and to the young generation, irrespective of their religious or sectarian identity. Because what I had figured out, that most of the books that I had read were there's of course amazing scholarship on Imam Ali. There's in Arabic, Persian, Urdu, English as well, English mostly translations. And most of the works are approached through a very specific religious sectarian lens. So you see a lot of work on the, from the Shia tradition, amazingly important, same from the Sunni tradition, from the Sufi mystic tradition. All of those approaches to looking at Imam Ali are well known. However, those all works are popular in their own schools of thought. So I thought writing on Imam Ali in a way that makes sense to Shias, Sunnis, Sufis, mystics, or perhaps any other sectarian identity. And that I thought the best way to present that is through a story. And then the second challenge was, having not been trained as a historian, and I'm a public policy scholar with my PhD in public policy, not even political science or part of political science, part of history. So the next challenge was, of course, you're writing a story, but the story to be very credible. And if I had to live up to my goal that it should equally attract the Sunni and the Shia and the Sufi and the non-Muslim, what sources I should look at. And these sources I had to then not only first read, but benefit from sources from the mainstream Sunni traditions, Shia tradition, and other mystical traditions as well. So that was one goal, and it was, I found it an immensely amazing and a rewarding experience, because as it turned out, that all the central features of Hazrat Ali and his life and his message are prevalent and available in all religious traditions. So it's not that you'll find something so specific in one Shia tradition that is not available in the Sunni tradition. And I wanted the answer to the basic question of why the Muslim heroes to us are presented in a way which ultimately at times becomes divisive. Why these narratives of Muslim great models are boxed into these different boxes, and you always approach, each tradition approaches as if they are only limited to that one lens, whereas all the major facts about Hazrat Ali, his life, are available in all sources. Also a little bit about this idea of heroes. I think this is extremely important, that the heroes and the models that Muslims so often think about are all in the history books, and if I may dare say, the stories or the messaging or the narrative about the Muslim role models, at times including the great personality of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we have made it so much academic. I'm not using it as a negative term. I'm myself academic. Often people mention the word academic as if to say this is too divorced from reality, or too archaic, or too complicated. I'm using it in a different sense. The contemporary meaning in our day-to-day life is not, it seems, relevant to our religious discourse, because in many ways religious discourse has been handed over to seminaries. And seminaries, in a way that the theological debates become so complicated. And in the process of this book, I became a member of WhatsApp groups of various Shia groups as well as Sunni groups and Sufi groups. And I was amazed and very, very bothered by the kind of discourse and narratives, which was very scholarly perhaps for some of them, but I realized that has absolutely no meaning or no relevance to ordinary people. So continuing to present our models in way which are only historical facts without providing a relevance to the day-to-day life of an ordinary Muslim, I think that's the disconnect. Why, if I may dare say, the great ideals of Islam are not very clearly seen in the practice of the Muslims. That's one point. And I thought, again, my contribution can be through storytelling. The second thing is, the way I approached it was linked to my being a humble student of and teacher of security studies and counterterrorism and those issues. And that also is relevant here, because I had figured out irrespective of any major terrorist group organization's model that you look at, whether it is Al-Qaeda and ISIS, whether it is Taliban, whether it is all other smaller groups which are Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, to Lashkar-e-Jhangvi in Pakistan, to Jamaat Islamiyah in Indonesia, you will see first and foremost all these extremist groups are first sectarian, then they become regional terrorist groups, then they become global terrorist groups. Their first identity, their radicalization happens because of the sectarian narrative. So, and what is sectarianism all about? Unfortunately, is linked to the Shia and Sunni. There are so many other Muslim sects also, and that diversity should be appreciated. But primarily, the hatred against the Shia is the central theme of most of the modern extremist and terrorist groups. And that's why I thought, touching upon or trying to approach Hazrat Ali's life, bringing him some of the major themes which I figured out. And I'm not now presenting this as something which may sound very good, but I can give examples on each. If you ask me of 3 to 5 central themes of Imam Ali's personality, what is the first thing? An ordinary Muslim will always say Heir-e-Karar, or Imam Ali in the battlefield, and every Muslim take pride in that. Can anyone deny what Ali did in Uhud or Badr or Khaybar, Sunni, Shia, irrespective of the sect? Can anyone deny? No one can. But that so often is seen. I often think in Pakistan, the highest military award is Nishan-e-Haider, same as the other cases. And that, of course, is true. And that without Ali's bravery and courage, Islam in its very nascent years would not have succeeded. But if you have to look at his whole life and come out with some central features, what would those be? In my study, and which I have presented, is I would, number one, actually make a case. It's tolerance. It's Ali's role as a unifier. It is Ali's role as somebody who's pro-people. Pro-people, in a sense, pick up Nahjul Balagha, for example. And its English translation, even if you can search it, you'll be amazed at the number of times Hazrat Ali is emphasizing the welfare of the ordinary people. And he was not saying, I'm trying to help those people who are on my side, or those who had sided with me in a certain debate or in a certain political context. No, it was beyond that identity. Justice meant justice for everyone. Egalitarianism meant it is for everyone. Pluralism, that's the other. After you being unifier, after being tolerance, after being these 2 points, I would say the biggest tolerance. Why I would say, just one example, Khawarij. Khawarij were I would say, the founders of the modern day terrorism in a sense. That was the first time. These are so rigid and extremist. When they fought Hazrat Ali, and you will not find any Muslim historian, I mean, you'll find today there are some people who go to the extent of even defending or saying something positive about Yazid. That's the new tragic trend. But pick up Khawarij, you will not find anyone in history other than the Khawarij themselves who will support them. When Khawarij dealt with Hazrat Ali, they would challenge him while he was sitting on the pulpit in the mosque, and Imam Ali's close friends will say, no, Imam, just don't let them talk. And he said, no, I will allow everyone to speak. The mosque in Hazrat Ali's time, anyone could stand up and challenge and say anything. When the time for burial of some of the Khawarij who had fought Hazrat Ali, they said, okay, let's dig have a big grave, put everyone's body there. He said, no, I am even willing to go and pray their funeral prayers because they were misdirected. Today, are we willing to give this actually benefit to any terrorist? No, we are not even in the modern day ready to do that. The point I'm making, going deep into those stories, why are those stories not mentioned? In a religious context, they don't lead to what we in South Asia call wah-wah, or the ordinary people will not feel energized enough because they'll see, oh, somebody's trying to really get a different message to you. So the time is limited, whether it is Barelvi tradition or Sunni or Shia tradition. There's such a political economy of modern religiosity and political economy of religious preaching that the speakers are seen based on who's the most popular. And you're most popular, you have a very limited time. You always, Khaybar, you start talking about Ali and Khaybar, everyone is energized and say, wow. You have heard the story 500 times. But you will not find time to go into the minute details which will touch upon your heart and say, okay, being tolerant is very important. being forgiving is extremely important. Being open to ideas and open to somebody who challenges your ideas and listening to them is extremely important. The priorities of Ali, when I read those works, and I say it, I grew up in a tradition to be a lover of Ali, and in fact, I had a parent who was a Sunni, and my one parent was Shia. Same in my elder tradition, my grandfather and grandmother belonged to different sectarian traditions, so I'd always seen those debates and participated in both traditions. While studying this, and I can claim in a humble way, I can't leave out any major speaker, any major Shia or Sunni speaker in Pakistan, India, also in UK. I lived here for a year or so while studying in US. I had the opportunity to listen to so many. But when I started reading from the mainstream works, I should not say a contradictory personality or different personality came up, but I read stories which I thought, I have never read this story, ever. And that to me was a new surprise. I wanted to bring that in a digestible fashion. And the purpose is again to bring the commonality in terms of resources, in terms of ideals, in terms of not that I had compromised. For instance, in one case, and I'll close with that, I mentioned I went to a very senior Shia scholar, and I asked for the final advice, and he said, well, you have picked a different topic. Why don't you leave out Saqifa and the problems between Ali and Abu Bakr and Umar and Usman? I said, that would be a very unfair and a wrong biography. How can I write a biography of Imam Ali without talking about his differences or his other issues, which are maybe will hopefully not offend people, but at least will be surprising for many people. But looking into those issues also, I realized that most of the issues on the controversial nature of aspects are also covered in all Muslim traditions. So my last point, Muslims either are not reading history at all or reading only that part of history which is very divisive. So reading history and also confusing reading history and reading religious message in itself. If there's anything which brings this unique thing in Imam Ali's life than any other person it is even if you leave out completely the history aspect. The mere spiritual aspect is so deep. And I will encourage you, just glance through these two things, Vijal, and you will get, I'm sure this audience, all of you know, one is Du'a Komel, which is recited mostly on the Friday prayers, this Friday night. This is available in English translation everywhere. You just search it. Reading it, it's an amazing ideal prayer in a sense. And the second one is on the political and governance issue, Ali's letter to Malik al-Ashtar, which opens up anyone's eyes with focus on taxation, with focus on so many aspects of ordinary life, which I had in many cases assumed the early Muslim leaders had not even thought about those, frankly. And you'll be amazed how much of the political philosophy of Islam is embedded there. So that's the other tragedy. At times, the historical narratives and historical differences keep us away from the prayers and from the political philosophy aspects of Islam. I thought Ali's life combines each one of these things in it. And that's why I thought that's what I present. Sorry, I took longer than what I thought. Please.
Thank you so much. Sajjad.
Thank you, and thank you for asking me to comment and ask some questions. Before I ask my first question, let me just say one thing.
I think your mic is off.
Is it?
Or you can take this for the time being.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be connected. Is it on?
Yeah, it is now.
No, it's not. Oh, okay. Thank you for asking me to be part of this conversation. Before I ask my first question, I thought I would just comment on one thing which relates to this issue of narrative, and particularly of corrective narrative, which I think is very important. And I'm using a corrective narrative in three ways. Firstly, as you mentioned, this idea that we need to approach the figure, the personality, the legacy of the Imam in a much more holistic manner, right? So of course, people sometimes focus on bravery and leave everything else out. Some people focus just on the spirituality and devotion and leave the social life out. Some people only look at the politics and the social life and leave everything else out. And that's obviously because we have different emphases in our current world. Some people are more interested in, what are the social and ethical issues facing us. Some people are more interested in metaphysics and so forth. So a holistic view is extremely significant. And the fact that on the whole, we don't get this, because that requires quite a deep contemplation of the sources. Most of us do not have that deep contemplation of the sources. In that sense, people talk about Amir al-Mu'mineen as being Mazloom, right? So him being Mazloom is because people do not actually know him. People do not read the Nahj. People do not read the Nahj al-Balagha seriously, whether it's in Arabic or whether it's in the very many, to be honest, awful translations which exist out there, right? That's one aspect of a corrective. The second aspect of a corrective narrative is, as you put it, really re-engaging with stories. That's really how we learn. In almost every field of understanding humanity, we learn, especially things like ethical values, especially ideas about the nature of reality, we learn this through stories. Because not everyone engages with abstract ideas. If you give them a story, if you give them an example, it immediately becomes alive for them. It becomes something which is real, which is meaningful, which in a sense they can imitate, because they understand how that works. And so in that sense, a corrective narrative, to take Amir al-Mu'mineen away from the specialists. Right, now I say this as an academic, you said as well, I'm perfectly happy doing that, quite simply because, the Ali of the philosopher is not the same as the Ali of the historian, is not the same as the Ali of the poet, etc. But we need to go beyond that. We need to see what sort of narrative really engages people, and different people in different ways. And the third aspect, which I think is really significant, is the corrective narrative about what Islam is. As you mentioned this, particularly in the context of security studies, but that's extremely important, because that is being contested. We're now in this world in which the very idea that there could be more than one narrative about Islam is contested, but even more that what tends to be in the public sphere is a very skewed sense of it, right? So I'm not saying that we have a narrative about Islam which is about peace and tolerance and love and diversity alone. It's actually much more than that. But it's fundamentally a narrative which is about human flourishing. That's what's important. We want a narrative about Islam which is, I gave a lecture many years ago which I called the story of us. And I said that's what Islam is. It's a story about us as humans, us as individuals who are constantly on this journey from God and returning to God. And the way in which we traverse this, we narrate our story, is by going in the footsteps of the friends of God, who of course ultimately are the ultimate wali, who is Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali, right? So those are like the three kind of aspects of this narrative which I would stress as being very significant. And the question of audiences are important as well. I think what's interesting about the book is everyone, I think, will find something within this which might be new, which might be a different perspective, because it's very difficult to put yourself in someone else's shoes and see how it is. It's very difficult to suddenly imagine that you're a Bektashi Sufi in the Balkans, or that you are Barelvi Sunni if you're not familiar with that tradition, or etc., etc., etc. So that is an interesting element of that as well. So that brings me to, I guess, my first question, which is, when you were researching this and when you were trying to put this narrative together, can you give me one example of something that you came across, which you then used in the book, which surprised you, which was new to you?
Thank you so much. And you have already reminded me of a couple of stories. One thing, not only that was very new, but when I presented it to many scholars, I could immediately see surprise on their faces. And this is more on the Shia side. And there's one example from the Sunni side. On the Shia side, again, this is an anecdotal thing, but this reminds me of, and I pay my condolence to the death of Grand Ayatollah Sayyidul Hakim, who just passed away 4 days ago. He was one of the very important sources of my research. I had spent time with him at least, I think 6 or 7 times, and every time there were 3 to 4 meetings. Each meeting was 3 to 4 hours. This was an amazing experience. And what I learned from him had amazed me, and 2 things which he told me. I last had the honor of meeting him just about 20 days ago when I went to Najaf, and I'm glad, because the promise was that I'll be able to bring the book to him. So when I was with him and I asked him one question, I said, Sayyid, when I was leaving a year and a half ago, I said, please, can you tell me the parting message, what you would think should be one of the themes of my book? He said, well, don't say or write anything which gives anyone this wrong idea that all that Ali had was something which was his personal or something that he received directly. Everything that Ali had, his traits, his features, was a gift to him from the Prophet. Now, when I said so many times to this, my friends, family in the Shia side, they look at me by a little surprise. Not that they doubt or any of them think that Ali had received anything from Jibreel directly. No one says that. No mainstream Shia. But however, because the narrative, with my due respect on the Shia side, at times has become so much, which starts from, the starting point is so different that at times it is forgotten that everything that Ali had was a gift to him or something that was his because of his association with the Prophet. As his wasi, as his friend, as his successor, as his heir. That was one thing anecdotal, and this because from him it was coming through in a different way. And when I asked him at that time for why, to explain this to me, he mentioned an anecdote, not an anecdote actually, a quote from the 5th Imam, which I have mentioned in the book, which I couldn't find anywhere. And he found, his staffers or research folks found it for me from Mufid, Sheikh Mufid, which was that, and this is a famous story, that when at the victory time in Mecca, when the Prophet ﷺ with all the Muslims have gone, the first time they are now victorious, standing in front of Mecca, in front of Kaaba in Mecca. First, we know that Ali stood on the shoulders of the Prophet and broke the idols. It's well known. Every tradition has this story. The real story, or the full story, I should say, the complete story is that first, Prophet asked Ali to go down, and Prophet wanted to stand over Ali's shoulder. And Ali couldn't hold him. And then Prophet said, okay, I'm standing. You, Ali, you stand on my shoulder. So there was this whole theological question. Sayyid Hakim was telling me. He said then, why Ali couldn't hold the Prophet, and Ali was the one who had picked up the door of Khaybar, which was 10 times heavier than 10 people, and many other occasions. And the Prophet, for instance, would ride on a camel also, so anyone could hold Prophet. Why Ali couldn't hold him? And he said the reason is that Ali was an Imam and it was Prophet. If Prophet was dependent on Ali to do something so critical, then Prophet would have been dependent on Imamat on somebody else. And that was not the cause. It was Imamat which could stand on the shoulders of the Prophet. Because Imamat is the extension, in a way, not in a prophetic sense, but extension of the message and being the heir. And I found this so useful construct to help me understand. But frankly, when I've explained this, at times people have difficulty. One other example of story or anecdote related to this is when I spoke to a major Sunni conference in California, and the event organizer called me before that. He said, Hassan, there are 1,100 people who have signed up, so be careful. I said, what do you mean by careful? No, I knew what he's saying. He was saying this, all Sunni audience, please don't pick up any sectarian issues. I said, look, I've written this book to defeat and counter sectarianism. Don't worry, but still tell me, what do you want me not to talk about? He said, no, I just want you to be careful. Now, the event happens, he introduces me, and he introduces me after I spoke. Now, the Q&A session like this started, and he said to audience, there were like, I think, hundreds of people, of mostly, I think, 99% or 90% from our Sunni brothers and sisters. And he said, Hassan Abbas speaks like a Sunni, he writes like a Sunni. At that moment, I was a little surprised, but I said, okay, I'm very happy to be called a Sunni and a Shia. I'm absolutely equally fine. But later on, I asked him, I said, so you said I speak like a Sunni, write like a Sunni. Was there a reason? Were you just more concerned about your audience? He said, no. I have read your book, the first 2 chapters. Your love for the Prophet is so obvious. Only Sunnis love the Prophet that way. I said, excuse me? Are you saying Shias are not in love with the Prophet? He said, no, you guys, the Shias love Ali more. I said, no, that is wrong. He was an imam of a very important mosque, one of the biggest mosques. And since then, I've been telling this story to my my Shia friends, saying, look, I don't know what you're doing. There's some problem, there's some narrative disconnect. Why speaking about the Prophet in this way gave this totally wrong impression? Shias love the family because they love the Prophet. That's why that is the reference. No one is directly related to the family in that sense. But these 2 stories or anecdotes I was immediately reminded of, which I often then share with the permission of the people with whom this happened, just to make the point that there are so many basic things which surprises people if we are talking to a different audience. We are so used to talking to our own, in our religious, not sectarian, or in our own communities, which is absolutely fine. That's the pride. That diversity should be celebrated. But maybe if all the communities maybe get together in some events, that would help take care of some of the misunderstandings. I hope I answered it right, or I went in a different direction.
No, I think you gave us an example. Thank you. I think your point about echo chambers is very significant. I've often thought that when it comes to the Nahj al-Balagha, or when it comes to some of the ad'iyah of the supplications, we should actually be presenting these as works of world literature, and not just say this is something very specific. But that requires a certain temperament. It also requires a certain presentation of the material in a way which is accessible. Again, unfortunately, most of the existing translations fail to do that. I think even most Sunnis picking up those translations would have no idea what was going on. So that's definitely the case. I guess the question I want to ask you then is, what has the response of the book been? When you've done a number of these sort of events, and in different contexts, how do you think people have been responding to the book? And can you give me one unusual positive response and maybe one unusual negative response? Because you must have had at least one negative response.
Many. Thank you so much. Your questions are, to me, a great this buffer zone, which is helping me, because for the last 3 days, the reason I'm here is as a part of a US government delegation. So I spent one whole day in one think tank, Chatham House, another in IISS, and the third one talking about Afghanistan for the last 4 days. So it helps me come back into my zone, at least in this regard. And on examples, some of the unusual response was one. Is this going live on YouTube? No, it's okay. So this is, but that's fine. This is from the most renowned, well-known Islamophobe, Daniel Pipes, who wrote a review of the book. Then he put it through on Amazon, and then he mentioned this on various other websites, and he called it, this is a missionary work. The person has penetrated the US government at the highest, at academic policy level, and he's using US government money to project his personal agenda, which is Ali. One, if someone thinks Ali is my personal agenda, I'm happy, this will help me at some point, but that's of course not the case. And I was surprised. The person knows it. He was a PhD in Islamic studies from Harvard. So I called a couple of my friends in American media. I said to them, this is what a review has been written, and should I respond, get into a public debate on social media? And they said, no, this is a badge of honor. Person of his credentials, if he's criticizing you, it's good for you. It means you're doing something right. No need, he wants funding from his extremist Islamophobes, so if you get into a debate, he gets more privilege. By that token, I should not have even been talking about it, but that is the first example that comes to my mind. The other example is, again, I'm sorry if it comes to there's no purpose for me here to score a point, but Islamic scholar, of a very renowned Islamic scholar, when he read it and he said, I belong to this one tradition, and after reading it, I have gone into the Tafzil Ali group, which is more on the Sunni tradition. There's a large group, not a large group, a scholarly group. Professor Sajjad would know much more than me on this, but those who believe that let's accept history as it is. No one can deny that Abu Bakr, Umar, and Usman were the caliph number 1, 2, and 3. Can anyone deny that? That's part of the history. But the Shia argument is that Ali's right was taken away, and there was great injustice done, and Ali should have been the first caliph as well. However, there's among the Sunnis, Barelvi tradition, also in other Tafsili groups, who believe that Ali was higher in status, which is all the Sufis, by the way. I think great majority of them believe as well, that Ali's spiritual status was much higher. But in political sense, the political successor was Hazrat Abu Bakr, then Hazrat Umar, and Hazrat Usman. Those were the conversations that are coming to my mind, not necessarily ideal, both of these, but that's what I thought. And then there were some questions on resources, which I respect. I must admit, before started working on this, I was not fully aware of all what are the core Shia texts which I should look at. And I figured out soon that most Shias actually don't know, which is that Sheikh Mufid, Sheikh Saduq, Sheikh Tusi's 2 book, or which are the core texts. And on the Sunni side, we know more a little bit because of the Sahih Sitta. And I saw some questions which are legitimate questions on resources. I should have looked at the primary sources, but then the challenge is of my limited capacity to translate Arabic or Persian directly, which I can a little bit, but I always need dictionary and etc. So those, and I realized that's one lacuna. It helped me also in a way because I was looking for English translations. But the most interesting is the last point. Almost in the last few days, I mentioned this to a very leading Shia scholar. I said, there's no good English translation of Kafi, the main, the hadith of the 12 Imams, the Shia tradition. And he said, there's no good translation of Kafi even in Urdu. And so the point I want to make from this is what became so obvious to me. And this is about many translations as well. For example, in all leading books on Imam Ali, almost all, which are available in English language, I found some common sources. When I started to dig deep and find those in Arabic at least, or at least find the book, the page, in mostly the way the footnotes are done in our modern tradition and maybe in the scholarly tradition, please correct me, Sajjad, I have found that there is a huge gap in this sense that normally in many of the books that I read, a book name, author name of course, and page number is mentioned, but no mention of which edition published where. So it is impossible to know what was published in Lebanon or Persian and to find that source. And in many cases, if there was a mistake committed, I found that mistake of page number or translation in 20 books because everyone copied. And I said, so I'm not the only one who's just copying stuff from here and there. It is, so my point, what became so obvious to me, lack of scholarship. We have focused so much on the narrative, the personal speeches and majalis and in other khutbat, that the tradition of written scholarship, which is the essence in so many ways, I found it lacking. Please correct me, this is my observation, you know far better than me on this.
Well, I mean, the only thing I'll say on that is that it's good that you've published a book, because that forces people to read. It's really as simple as that. I mean, I think, unfortunately, for a community which claims to be the community of Ali, there aren't very many readers in that community, which of course should not be the case. So in that sense, I think it's a really important contribution, because at least it forces people to read, and it then also, I think, gives them indications of where they can follow up. Right? There might be something they'll be interested in, they can follow up. If they're interested in this question of the ahad to Malik al-Ashtar, then they can actually go and read it. You know, if they're interested in supplications, they can go and read that. If they're interested in the devotion in the Sufi tradition, then they can find out and they can experience that. So, you know, I think reading is an important act, and I actually do believe that reading is not just a passive thing, but is actually something which changes you, which fundamentally changes you. It has a certain impact upon yourself. It has a certain impact upon the soul, and it triggers certain switches and interests, which are important too. So it's not all about just experience in life and social, the social sphere, but also reading can kind of propel you in certain ways. Do we want to open up to the audience? Maybe one last thing. So I thought, so I'll say this for one last thing. And in a sense, this is a question about what next. So, you said that it's very important for us to produce narratives about heroes. So what about narratives of sheroes?
Narratives
Of sheroes, female heroes. What about those sort of narratives? Because that's a very important aspect of the Shia tradition, and that's an important aspect of what we think, of course, Islam is, and that is of great significance in the contemporary world.
Well, I have a good news in that sense. Just yesterday, in fact, I was with my editor at Yale University Press, and we were talking about the book, the response, the reviews. Still we're waiting a paperback, and there's some things I want to add or change, and I'll later seek your guidance whether I should attempt some changes or not. But they said, I was asked what's next, and it was a conversation that already started, and I said, Bibi Fatima Zahra, there's her biography I can't find. There are a couple of those, unlike Hazrat Ali, there's almost none which were published or written, I should say, first in English. It's almost same is the case there. And to my pleasant surprise, my publisher is so happy. They said, absolutely. But then there was a condition. The condition is interesting because my field is security studies. It was said, well, first we want you to write a new book on Taliban, because my previous book was on Taliban. And this has happened in the past. Al Jazeera TV, maybe they'll not invite me if they listen to this, but recently, the book, this was on a back. I mean, I wanted to show off, because this is the only way you get book sales, international audiences listening to you. And I was talking on the rise of Taliban, but my book was behind it. They said, no, we want you to change it with your other book, The Taliban Revival, which is more relevant. That they're true, they're right in that regard. But I thought that, no, this is my way to project my book. But I have now almost very close to sign a book on Bibi Fatima. But along with that, I have to first write a book on Taliban. But that's the compromise I have to make for my own field. And that's also a very important contemporary question, because they think that's the other thing. The security narratives, I mean, so much is, one person in that conversation with many editors yesterday, it came up when they asked about, and this is indirectly relevant, whether Taliban have changed or not. And somebody said, well, has Shariat changed? I said, no, that will be an unfair thing. Taliban's Shariat is not the Shariat, even not in the Sunni tradition. But that's what the Western audience thinks. And I thought, okay, there's something there I can contribute as well. But the short answer, you're absolutely right. I was surprised, and actually the credit in the case of this book goes to my three daughters, Zainab, Zahra, and Sherbano. On every point, and they were my great kind of editors, they said, Baba, you have written about only Bibi Fatima. There were other wives as well. There were other daughters. And I read, for instance, I must introduce my ignorance. For the research of this book, I learned that the wives of the fifth Imam, the Imam Baqir and Jafar, and sixth Jafar Sadiq, their wives and daughters and family members, they were great scholars. They were teaching in the seminary in Medina. For each of the women leaders and role models were extremely important. All what Muslims know, in the Sunni tradition, they cannot go beyond Aisha, because that's many of the traditions come from Bibi Aisha. In the Shia tradition, yes, focus on Bibi Fatima Zahra and Bibi Zainab, extremely important, but as if there was no fourth woman existed in the Muslim world. Is there a biography written of the Prophet's mother? Or Bibi Khadija? You'll be amazed. You'll not find a biography of Bibi Khadija or anyone else. So there's a huge gap, and there's so much to be done for young Muslims. That's why I'm pitching something different. I had mentioned to Jafar, any students who are here, they can buy a book for £5. And I had said £5 because I thought, okay, when someone pays something, then they read it. But I would change it. Any young person here, any student, it'll be a gift from me. We want the young people to read books and write books. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions, but I would let the audience ask. I'm sure they must have got lots of questions. I don't have mic. Sorry, you don't have mic, so
If you just speak loudly,
yes,
and then we can
loudly
maybe.
introduce yourself and please.
Thank you so much. Extremely important question. One, please pick a copy right after this, and you'll see. This was a big debate with my editor as well, whether we put up front a chapter with all the sources. But this is in the end. There's a note on sources. I picked 30 scholars, and so I picked all the 4 main Shia sources: original Sheikh Mufid, Sheikh Saduq, Tusi's 2 books. Then I picked on the Sunni Hadith side, I picked 3: Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, Sunan ibn Nasa'i. Sunan ibn Nasa'i is the most amazing book every Muslim should read. For Ahlul Bayt, the Fazail of Ahlul Bayt, the way it is projected by Nasa'i, I think he was the real big Shia. I am very convinced. Because what Nasa'i has said, it really opened my eyes. Even some of the Hadith traditions which Shia traditions have, the fuller version of those in support of Ali are actually done by Nasa'i. So first I looked at those historical sources for my principal history. Then I came to more contemporary, and I picked, in everything, I picked equal number of Shia and Sunni sources. So I looked at the 5 or 6 major biographies of Hazrat Ali, which one was by Murtaza Mutahri, there is another by Qureshi, there are 2 by Mufti Jafar in Urdu. This was one other issue. When I picked the sources, and Sajjad would also be interesting for you, I was told by the peer reviewers, why are you referencing the Urdu commentaries and biographies? I said, so the Urdu speakers are not Muslim? They said, no, this is the Arab speakers we want. Why? Islam came for only Arabs? And another bias that is entrenched. The mainstream Arabic language sources are 1,000 years old, or 800 years old in some cases, or 1,400 years old. But there is a bias in academia and Islamic studies that no, it has to be Arabic language. So I went beyond, and then I picked contemporary scholars, from Sayyid Hussain Nasser to of course, Madelang. And so I put all those 30 names, and when it comes to non-Muslims, from William Chittick to others as well, for the Western non-Muslims, there was no need for me to count, but I was so particular that my main sources between the Shia and Sunni should be equal. And of course, in the Sufi tradition, I couldn't have built this story without getting to the poetry of Rumi, to Iqbal, Dr. Muhammad Iqbal, or his Persian language. Again, in many cases, their excellent translations are available. So that my limitation was in this sense that when I had to, for something, I had to go to the original source, I had to look at 3 translations or 4 translations, and at times pick and choose for certain words. But I went to the core mainstream Islamic history sources. Thank you.
She was asking about the sources. So please correct me, Sister Zainab, if I'm wrong. She was asking about the sources, what kind of sources the author used in this book, and because given his background, his academic background, she was interested in knowing kind of different sources and languages they were in. And I mean, I've read this book, and the way he has used and has presented these different sources is very accessible. And I mean, he has given lots of citation references where you can access that original source online. So that's I would also say, I think we need to have that in modern scholarship to easily accessible things if one wants to approach.
Oh, sorry. So my educational background, thank you very much. So my educational background, I did I'm originally from Pakistan, so I had my main degrees in political science, history, and Persian language, actually. These were my majors, and then I did my master's in history in Pakistan. But by the time I was studying for my master's, I joined government service, civil service in Pakistan, police service, and I came to US. I did my law as a British evening scholar in a law school, University of Nottingham. So I have a law degree in human rights law from UK. Went back to Pakistan in police service, and then I think it actually my educational experience in UK triggered this. I owe it to my 1-year education here. I'm not saying it because I'm here. It was an amazing experience in Nottingham. So I went then for my PhD to Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, about 5-6 years there. My PhD work was mostly, I studied
Southwest Asia, politics and culture in Southwest Asia, but it was a policy school. So everything was about contemporary politics. And the year I landed in US, that's the same September when 9/11 happened. So as a police officer from Pakistan who had served on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, dealt with Taliban, all my work was on Pakistani extremism and those issues of policing. There's actually the leading expert today on Pakistani police and other police matters, Zoha, is here. I'm very honored, Zoha, that you are here. So I did some work on policing, then I did a book on Taliban by Yale University Press. First, it was the biggest challenge, and this is, I'm saying for the young people, how difficult it is to get mainstream academic publishers. Because it's easy to publish it on a book like religion. You can pick a local publisher, religious publisher, there's nothing wrong with them, but there's no peer review process, there's no quality control, there's no authenticity or credibility that is given to it. So it was hard to get this book on track because my publisher said, you have done all work on extremism, terrorism, Taliban, Pakistan, policing. What is your credentials on this book? And I had to really convince them. In fact, what really got me this contract was, my editor said, the same editor who yesterday was, she's so kind, she wants me to write the biography of Bibi Fatima for Yale University Press. She had said, okay, Hassan, what you're telling me is all history. No one is interested. Tell me why Ali is important today. And this was 2017 or 16. I said to her, I think there would have been no ISIS if Ali's worldview on governance and worldview on Islam would have accepted and would have become mainstream. Then she jumped in her seat. But at the end she said, Hassan, where is ISIS in the book? I said, well, I've concluded it is Khawarij which became ISIS, so that's the link, there's just 2 sentences. But by then she had read the book and she said, okay, the peer reviews have come good. So this is my long background. But with this book, it has helped me tremendously. One thing related to it, my people in my field, there's radio silence because they're saying, oh, what is he doing? What is he up to? Where is this book coming from? How does, and I have to really make a case. No, trying to understand the Muslim narrative, the Muslim spirituality, the depth of Muslim understanding, the richness of Islamic spirituality, you have to go to Ahlul Bayt to find that out. So I am now making that indirect case, and that's the other. Thank you for that question. That helps me explain the context.
If I can just add one small thing to it. I mean, I think the timing is a good one as well, quite simply because there's a lot of interest in the market for, really wide, sort of broadly focused studies on what Islam is right now, which are, within the academic context, but also trying to reach new audiences. There's a lot of interest in that, and so in that sense, you've picked a good topic, a good counter-narrative, which addresses that. And one small thing on Arabic and non-Arabic. I mean, I think one thing we forget is that, of course, the vast majority of Muslims are not Arabs, right? So the question is, how did they get their Islam? They didn't get it reading Arabic text directly. They often got it from different vernaculars, which exemplified and epitomized the stories, right? So you have the Persian poetry. Everyone knows Rumi's version of what happens in Khandaq. No one's read the Arabic. Well, hardly anyone's read the Arabic. Similarly, when it comes to different examples of the Imam's generosity or openness, people know this from Punjabi poetry or Sindhi poetry or Urdu poetry, right? So, and that's because that poetry makes those stories living for those people. If you just tell them that in Arabic, it's meaningless to them. And so those sources are so important because they then represent what these fundamental narratives are. And that's why they're valuable as well. And those are the stories when you go to Najaf, you ask people going to Najaf from different places, why did you come here? What inspired you, etc. They're not going to quote you a 10th century Arabic text. They're going to say, these are the stories we lived in, these are the stories we saw embodied in front of us, and they'll probably quote a verse of poetry.
Thank you. And also, Sajjad, welcome to add to anything. The second question, if you can say a little more so that I'm clear on that.
So it's often, global discussions, as you mentioned, that Sunnis seem to follow the Prophet, right? Or they tend to follow the Prophet. And Shias, I think, they're just following Muhammad. So I was going to say, to add to that, probably like the question, Prophet according to whom?
Correct.
So you follow the Prophet.
No, I get it. Thank you so much. One thing that I'm critical of, in a sense, Shia scholarship is that almost all the works on Shiism, there are some new ones recently as well, and I understand the need for it, but those are mentioned as Shia Islam, introduction to Shia Islam. And so what happens is that in the Western world, especially in the policy world, for instance, and even ordinary, when they want to engage in Muslims or want to learn about Muslims, this wrong figure also is given. Sunnis are 90%, Shias are 10%. So they say, okay, I have to really read one book on Islam. I better read the Sunni Islam because we have to deal with them all the Middle East. Mistakenly, they think. And the Shia works mostly from not only the scholars, but also from the Najaf Seminary or other places who are writing about Shia. They emphasize so much the Shia view that the title shows that. And that then leads to for the book to be relevant only to the Shias. Whereas in the Sunni, with all the other books, the Sunnis write mostly as a history of Islam. So that seems in reality that is Sunni history of Sunni Islam. But because it is written as history of Islam, most people go there. And there's a strange bifurcation, a strange kind of this factor which limits scholarship. Also, at the same time, so I believe in that was one purpose that I wanted to, and that's why we really had to think through the title, The Prophet's Heir, whether it may sound more pro-Shia or not. And I have a counter argument to that. It is proved through all mainstream Sunni sources as well, that the spirituality or the spiritual heir, even for many Sunnis, if not most, was Ali. But also the 90 and 10% want to establish, you just look at the demographics of the Arab world today. You'll be amazed the heartland of the Muslim world today, whether it is Saudi Arabia or actually part of Kuwait, Iraq, Egypt. The Shia population in the main heartland of the Arab world is close to 40%, if not 45, or between 35 to 45. So this the way these facts are projected globally, Sunnis are 90%, Shias are 10%, is absolutely a wrong myth and a wrong. Same in the case of Pakistan, for example. There was a debate. You just go by the basic census and the number of Shia centers and voting patterns in Shia majority areas, you clearly see the Shia population is between 20 to 25%. But in all old books, you'll see 7 to 8. You'll find the Sipai Sahaba or the extremist on the Ahl Hadith side of Wahhabi, they would say, oh, the Shias are 2 to 3%. So there's that debate as well, which then takes the focus away from, and people try to see which is the most popular narrative. And you're right, Prophet according to whom, but by and large, on the Prophet, it's the majority of the views are in the similar vein. Yes, the issues become more severe when in terms of succession or imamat, but by and large, all the sources that are on the Prophet, and please correct me, Sajjad, on any of these things, the sources used by both Shia and Sunnis when it comes to the Prophet's sayings and statements are by and large common. Will that be true? I'm not sure, but that's what I think.
I mean, there's an important overlap, but I wouldn't say they're the same.
Okay, overlap.
It's yeah, that's in a sense that's precisely the problem, that they're not the same. I think what's important there is the nature of the academic field. So Islamic studies on the whole is not Islamic studies, it's Sunni studies. That's the basic problem. But we often don't have a choice. So at the moment I'm editing an Oxford handbook of Shia Islam, quite simply because most Oxford handbooks which deal with Islam have very little coverage of Shia elements. And it's deliberately a corrective, and it's deliberately a kind of a slap in the face actually to the field. That's what we designed it at. And actually, we've kind of promoted on social media precisely as that, and some of my colleagues are not very happy with that. But I mean, who cares? I'm beyond caring about these things right now. But it's important, so you have to do it. And you've got to get to a point where when people are teaching Islam, they're looking much more broadly at issues around sources, so that you don't have to be confined to certain things. So that, when you're teaching about the Prophet, you have different models of who the Prophet is. And, regardless of the Wahhabi narrative, which has become dominant, the vast majority of Muslims over time have believed in a Prophet who is a perfect human being. It's really as simple as that. It's only the Wahhabi narrative of the Prophet as postman, which has become, and at that, a reluctant and slightly hesitant postman, which goes against that mainstream.
Thank you very much. I stand corrected, actually. And when I had mentioned most books are Shia, this kind of work is not included in that. But that's extremely important corrective in a sense to balance that, because otherwise that is missing. But my point was I would like to stand corrected and add that nuance what Professor Sajjad just mentioned. Thank you.
Can I ask? Thank you. So my question is linked to what Professor Rizvi has just mentioned about, for example, the kind of censorship was done against Imam Ali in Islamic literature. So how important is to have this kind of scholarship, given the kind of censorship or appropriation of Imam Ali in the Islamic studies, or as Sajjad said, Sunni studies?
Thank you so much. I had this point and I couldn't get a chance to talk about it, but my apologies to my Sunni audience here and elsewhere, but the reality is that the modern Sunni discourse in many ways is actually the discourse which is a very political discourse that was pitched and projected by Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. The distortions were so much entrenched, and later on within the Sunni tradition we know that there were certain hadith collectors and narrators who had said there was competition between them who had concocted more hadiths, and this was done in a very choreographed manner. So a lot of what came to be part of the mainstream Sunni tradition was actually not the Sunni tradition per se, was not linked to even the first three caliphs, but it was linked to Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. So and that one thing I have explained in the book, and I couldn't mince my words, I had to be very clear, categorical and candid, that if there was any counter challenge to Islam, that was Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan. And that counter challenge, and that's when, just imagine, and this is a question which many people, with all Muslims, need to think about. How was it conceivable that a person who is the prince of Ahlul Bayt after the Prophet, Hazrat Ali ibn Abi Talib, about whom we know, Ana Madinatul Ilmi wa Aliin Babuha, the Prophet is saying, I am the city of knowledge, Ali is the door. About whom is saying, Man kuntu Mawla fa haza Aliin Mawla. Whosoever considers me as the master, Ali is the master. 110 narrators. There is no other hadith, will it be correct, which has 110 original source narrators, or it must be among the very high. Yeah. And Ali is to me what Aaron was to Moses. The kind and type of things that are said in favor of Ali, and Ali is with Haqq, Haqq is with Ali. And after all that, Muawiyah was able to institute cursing of Ali from the Friday Friday sermon for 40 years. 40 years. Is it, it's how to explain that? There's no good answer from the Sunni scholarship to this question. How was that allowed? How was Ali's name, they tried to get it to an extent that when Hazrat Ali died, when he was killed in mosque, somebody in the governorate of Syria area said, when he was told Ali was killed in a mosque, he said, oh, what was Ali doing in the mosque? Because that was the level of propaganda against Ali. And the fact that the modern Muslim history has been able to come out of it to a great extent. There's an excellent new work. I'm forgetting the name. The book has just come out by Cambridge University Press by Nabil Hussain. Amazing work. He has expressed opposing the Imam. an amazing work, and his PhD work as well, which explains how in the Sunni tradition, Ali step by step then came out because people realized and they were able to get out the original sources and explain what was the Muawiyah's school of thought and how that created an issue. This was a big Muslim battle within it, but it is a question which still historians, scholars should look at. Why was that done? And how that it transpired. And this is accepted in mainstream Sunni or Barelvi tradition at least, and in all mainstream other places as well. But politics has become so sectarian that there's many who would really be offended if you would not take Muawiyah's name with respect, and that's very, very problematic. One can understand about other great personalities. One should be respecting everyone and consider everyone their due status. Be very careful about other people's views, respect others' views. That should be a core principle. The abusing and cursing in that sense creates more divisiveness. But on Muawiyah, I found it extremely difficult not to expose him. Without him, Ali's not very clear, because he was the one who challenged all these narratives. So that's why it's extremely important. And thank you for that question. I should have explained that. And I'll just in the end mention one thing. As I had said, all those, if there are any students, or if you're a father and you have, or mother, you have children who are in college, please take a copy as my gift. No need to pay for that. Thank you.
Is it true? I mean, I recall there was an issue of this book cover in Pakistan. What's the story?
That's true. Yeah, that's so. The book is close to being banned in Pakistan just because of the cover picture. Because they said it is blasphemous to show Ali. And I said, the features are not shown. All in Iraq, Iran, everywhere the pictures are there. This is actually, it's so interesting. In these days, Pakistan, the most famous drama is Arthur Ghazi. This was the Khoei tribe. So this painter was from Khoei tribe. So I checked it. I talked to a friend in Azerbaijan. I said, I need to know the tribe of the person. I got all the details. We purchased this with a lot of money. This is in British Museum. It was recently sold. So this is Hazrat Ali sitting in the middle. This is a beautiful picture that no one's features is shown. And so in Pakistan, so currently the Islamic ideology of council in Pakistan is reading the book. But luckily, the good news is, it is a pirated edition. There are two websites. It is the pirated edition. In both those is selling. They said we have printed twice or thrice this copy. So, and it's for 300 rupees. So if from US it goes, or UK, it is very expensive. So I said to one of my friends, and actually I can say publicly, the Prime Minister of Pakistan asked for a copy. Assigned 5 copies were sent to him. He discussed it with somebody. And I said to them, so why this book can't be in Pakistan? My book on Taliban, my book on Pakistan's drift into extremism, which is far more can be problematic on extremism issues are there. Why problem with this book? And this tells us, in many of our countries, things have become radicalized in a very strange way. So the book is in customs in Pakistan, I think 1,000 copies, not being allowed to go in, because Islamic Ideology Council has to gather guts to say this, it is okay. The reason they are saying is, they can't say, they can find anything inside because they're sources, and I have been by and large tried my best to remain, if not neutral, at least objective, or be respectful to even those who are considered honorable by somebody else. But they have this issue with the picture. They say, why Ali is being shown here? Okay. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for this. The most difficult was to write about Bibi Fatima and the 2 different narratives of her death. But on Saqifa and everything else, I think there's nothing that I left untouched. And the criticism, surprisingly, and this is again the nature of now religious discourse, surprisingly the biggest or the most consistent criticism that I've received, mostly from social media, is that why I'm calling Ali the Prophet's heir Abu Bakr, Umar and Usman were also heirs. I said, I'm not saying they are not political heirs. The word heir has a legal meaning. Everyone knew at the time of the Prophet's death who was the heir, because everyone said, Ali will bury the Prophet because Ali is the legal heir. No one else ever claimed that they were legal heirs of the Prophet. So it fits into that. Political heirs, so there were 4 political heirs, technically, Abu Bakr, Umar, Usman, Ali. No one can deny that. So Ali is at least one of those 4. And the third criterion is spiritual heir. So ask the Sufis who they consider as the heir or the patron saint. 90% or more than that will say always Ali is the spiritual master. Even the Sunni tradition, the Barelvis will say, even the biggest supporter of Ali, I heard it yesterday from a very leading scholar, and he was right. He said the biggest first Shia was Umar. Hazrat Umar, the second caliph, had said 70 times, I would have been dead if Ali was not there. Whenever there was a spiritual matter, the caliphs would go to Ali because they recognized the spiritual tradition. They were sitting on a political chair. On the spiritual matters, whether on justice, on fiqh, whenever they was stuck, they went to Ali. The most famous in Sahih Bukhari, and I have mentioned the quote, Umar had prayed, God, I don't want to be alive on a day when a difficult question comes to me and Ali is not there to help me. So everyone knew, including the first 3 caliphs, the spiritual status and the spiritual supremacy of Ali. So I would say the legal heir is Ali, the spiritual heir is Ali, the political heir, Ali shares it with the other 4. So if out of 3, I have 2.3 under Ali, so what's wrong with the heir? But so that is strangely, which is, I was expecting better criticism, but so far only this criticism has come from our Sunni friends, or saying, can there be an heir? So there is some challenge on the cover, but that debate that helps actually get the argument. I wanted it to be simply a life and legacy of Ali. And my editor who read it, after reading it, she said, Hassan, actually, I think, and I had never proposed this title. They said, I think what you're actually saying is that Ali was the Prophet's heir. I said, God bless you, you're right. That's what I'm trying to say. They said, then that's the title.